Alrighty, once again, the dead are coming back to life. This time we have the survivors holding up a shopping mall. We're talking this week about Dawn of the Dead, the original made in 1978 with George Romero, the godfather of zombies, and the remake was done by Zack Snyder, and we'll talk about both versions, of course. I think this time, though, before we kind of dive into the usual part, maybe one thing that is interesting about these zombie remakes is how, like what we talked about with horror before, that sometimes you can have these ideas being kind of brought out through the story rather than, having the story serve the themes and stuff like that. So maybe I think one thing we can look at or talk about is how that happens. Like kind of, when we kind of preaching like we kind of did with Black Christmas versus when does the ideas serve the story and stuff.
Right. You mean like rather than, you talking specifically about Black Christmas, the original or the remake?
The remake, yeah.
The remake, in terms of that sort of really explicitly hammers its political stance home. And
yes.
Yeah, I would say I would say it's not, well, certainly in Dawn of the Dead in the 1978 version, a lot of its points aren't really subtle, but they are still, there's still enough of them that they don't sort of overcrowd the main elements of the story. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of themes, I think, in the 1978 version that may not necessarily be obvious on first viewing, especially if you just a horror zombie movie. But yeah, what was your take on that in terms of
and I guess we'll kind of dive into the 78 version that like where of course the big thing that everyone knows now to some degree is that fact that like it's an illustration of 80s consumerism, and even though it was made in 78, it basically foreshadowed this kind of transition that was coming around the corner, which is where like nowadays if you walk through a shopping mall, a lot of them and stuff, they're pretty much like something out of this Dawn of the Dead where it's a lot more lifeless. There's basically empty to a great degree and stuff like that. And I think that's foreshadowed this kind of death of consumerism and just this kind of undead condition that kind of really developed and stuff.
Yeah, it's very true. We've gone through this phase of, with the 1978 version, he's pretty much sort of directly pointing the finger at malls and consumerism as the reason for so much sort of ill of the world at that time. But now we're post that. We're all ordering things on Amazon. We still have the consumerism, but we don't need the malls anymore.
Right.
And it's they are very. I remember the last time I went to a large mall. I think about 30% of the shops were closing down, and there really weren't very many people around. It was quite bizarre.
One quote that really stuck out to me was between Fran and Steven, and she's asking, what are they doing? Why do they come here? And Steven says some kind of instinct, memory of what they used to be or we used to do. This is an important place in their lives, and I feel like to some degree there was some of that as the kind of the malls were dying and stuff like that. And then to some degree, I have to admit that like there's still some part of our habits where we still go to the malls with like out of habit. And even though that like, nowadays, like, like I said, most of the things we buy on Amazon. So, I think what a lot of people do is they'll, check a size or they'll, look at, kind of different prices and stuff like that in the malls. And then they'll, go home and order on Amazon.
Yeah. Yeah. It won't be long before we're simply using, actual real stores as just places to try stuff on, or there'll be specific experiences. I kind of think the whole retail experience will become more like a boutique, in that you're going there for a brand will have a specific place and you go there to either try stuff on, or they may have something that I think will happen, but we'll see more of is things where stores offer you an experience that maybe with augmented reality or virtual reality. So you go in there, you stick on your glasses and you'll be able to do, there'll be things you can interact with. It will be like this experience brought to you by Levi's or something like that, and they'll try and sort of make something that's in between real life and a virtual experience in a particular store. But the idea of just going to lots of different places just to buy things, I think we're kind of coming to the end of that in a weird sort of way.
Right. And you know, at least here in the U.S., what we've seen is a lot of them have been gutted out and reused as like, community colleges or university extensions and stuff, and or just even like kind of fitness centers, like kind of, because there is such this square footage and space that basically they could put a lot more gym equipment and just other stuff like kind of in place of the shopping and merchandise and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you see this in a lot of places. It becomes more of a sort of places to have some more of a social experience. Kind of, in some respects, it's not really social, the gym, but it is sort of, in a way. Likewise, coffee shops like Starbucks. It's weird. Both of those things, you're always by yourself, more or less, but you're just in a surrounded by people. It's a very kind of fragmented social experience, but that's what tends to replace shops in a lot of places.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of kind of reminds me of the discussion we've had about social media, where to some degree we create these kind of bubbles around us by kind of staring down at our phones and stuff. Like we're with people, but then we're like still kind of like cloistered away in our little like you said, virtual reality. It's kind of, in a way, the social virtual reality.
Yeah. No. I think it was quite prescient. So that's, and I mean, as well as the very strong sort of theme of consumerism in Dawn of the Dead, which I'm sure lots of people have read in lots of other places. There's also this theme of alienation, in that you've got each of the characters that have they start off quite socially cohesive, and then by the towards 2/3 of the way of the movie, they've actually, location-wise, they're alienated in that they're marooned in this mall away from. There's no sort of society to go back to, and also each of them is they're all kind of veering off in their own kind of mindless direction of consumerism. And you see Fran and Steve, they're sleeping together, but they're both sort of like vacantly looking off in different directions. And there's this kind of, that also sort of leads into this thing of, I think one of the other real strong themes that isn't necessarily obvious is this one of a lack of purpose. That this new sort of levels of consumerism actually sort of lead people away from a life of purpose. Because if you look at the various characters' journeys, like Steve, he's very focused at the beginning in that he sees what's going on from his helicopter and he can see the carnage. It's not shown, but obviously he's much more aware than a lot of other people, especially in that news studio at the beginning. So he wants to escape and he wants to survive. That's his main focus. But by the end of the movie, he just wants to kind of protect them all, because he feels like, this is all the stuff that's theirs, and he's just like a big hoarder defending his castle. The stuff that's practically useless in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. Likewise, Roger starts off as a very level-headed law enforcer who's one of the few who can keep his head when all this chaos is going on. But then he gets sort of impulsive and careless and is kind of trying to sort of take risks for the thrill of it, because he's lost his purpose in society of being of needing to be that way. So I kind of think he's sort of saying it in multiple ways of, there is some division that comes with this, and there's also a lack of purpose, and that's pretty much what has happened to a lot of Western countries. We're just consumers we don't really make anything anymore. It's that most of the production is handled somewhere else, so we've become this society of consumers.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, though, about how if you are just a consumer, it's kind of like I mean, the extreme cases, like where that's what a parasite is, right? I mean, it just consumes. It doesn't really serve any purpose in the ecosystem. It doesn't it isn't really an active part of this cycle, right, of life, where that something is kind of born and, kind of fights and struggles and stuff, and then dies and serves a purpose for, being food for something else, or meanwhile it's consuming other things that like kind of, lower down the food chain and stuff. But if you're just consuming, then you're just totally out of that cycle, and you're just kind of just, sucking nutrients for your own sake of like, just existing and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, in this particular one, I think in a way zombies serve multiple different purposes,
Yes,
especially in George
definitely.
Romero's movies, because they're almost like an unthinking blank canvas, which you can throw your different points at. And I mean, in this one, in zombies, they basically just feed, but they don't necessarily need to eat. I mean, they all seem to keep going regardless of whether they eat human flesh or not.
Right.
And likewise, that's analogous to consumerism, and that we buy things that we don't need, and zombies eat things they don't necessarily need to eat.
Yeah.
But I figured something out, and this is the secret to how to figure out what the theme is in a Romero zombie movie, and that is because the zombies are basically unconscious, unthinking, not even the creatures, but they're not really people anymore. But it's very hard to figure out what the theme is from looking at the zombies. So you look at the humans and seeing what the plot makes them do to each other, the way they treat each other, is actually what the theme of the movie is about. Like, I think the Night of the Living Dead, if you actually look at how the people treat each other, there's this there's mindless killing between people.
Right.
And also there's no cohesion between the group of people that are trying to survive. There's all this fighting amongst each other, and they end up sort of killing each other. So I think the basic theme of that he's trying to say is, senseless violence between different sort of social groups is really the theme of that movie.
Yeah.
And in the Dawn of the Dead, you've got the people are more cohesive, but they all kind of lose their way, lose their purpose through consumerism.
Right.
And then then the real bad guys actually become the raiders, the other humans trying to kill off the other humans. So again, there's this kind of mindless violence. We're all fighting over these, what are essentially worthless material goods by the end of the movie. And that, I think, is the point he's trying to drive home with that. I think in Day of the Dead, you could sort of say that it's science or the government and their ability to deal with things that's really what he's trying to sort of is the theme of what he's trying to get at in that one.
Right. Yeah, I think a great part of it of Dawn of the Dead is just like the fact that like it's just a total reflection of consumerism, a total reflection of the relation of purpose and consuming versus there's no sense that any of them have any future plans to do anything else other than just survive and stuff. There's not even any discussion, which, not to get too much into the other series, but like in Walking Dead, they had similar kind of problems, or at a certain point, that was like where, at least in the major story arc, the characters there decided that like, let's just plant our, pole here, and like kind of, this is where we're going to like kind of, make home and stuff. Because up to the whole series, they were just wandering and stuff and surviving. And I think that's kind of like human nature to a degree, that like if we're just surviving, then it feels like or generally speaking, we feel we need more than just staying alive. And that's something I think that's very innately human. Also what kind of, made us really kind of transcend from being like kind of hunter-gatherers, and then things like civilization, all that came out of this kind of shift in our, desire. Like we wanted to kind of have something more, we wanted to kind of just to do something to make home, to kind of plant ourselves and everything. And I think that's kind of one of the things that like kind of really was a shift. And then at some point though, along that ways, then the whole consumerism thing kind of just started evolving, and kind of almost like a virus in itself that spread. And then to the degree, I think, what Romero is also reflecting is that this virus called consumerism kind of has infected us, and then we have not come to terms with it yet. That it's like kind of, we see, like you said, with like kind of just how things are with Amazon, and even though we are like kind of to some degree doing cool things with technology. But as we've talked about also in other episodes, just even like with, social media, right? On one hand, it was this great experiment of kind of connecting on one level, but to another degree, there's a lot of just consumerism of content now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point, and you've hit the nail on the head there. Really, that idea of just, I think you're right, and the point he's trying to make is us just concentrating on surviving and distracting ourselves with consumerism is really, leading to our downfall. And one of the things I noticed is that Fran is the only character I think that really tries to sort of keep an eye on the future, other than what's happening around her. I guess because she's pregnant, and you have to think about that she's looking out for the next generation. But her, she's the one who's most dissatisfied with just staying in the mall and wants to sort of talk about, traveling north, or our true north, perhaps, depending on how you want to, view it. But, she's the one that's obviously dissatisfied with it and doesn't want to just simply survive. But yeah, I think in terms of now what we see is technology, social media, we've got into another sort of form of attention consumerism where, again, we're now the zombies with our phones, I guess, maybe. So.
I think that's a great, transition into the 2012 version then, because of two things. Like, one is that, like, instead of Fran being pregnant and stuff, here in this case, we have this kind of thug and, kind of Russian couple. And, there he wants the, the baby to be born so badly and stuff that he's kind of willing to do whatever it takes. And it's less of a thing about having a view for the future than it is just, again, still surviving. So I think that kind of really lost some of that original kind of idea where Fran, like you said, kind of is keeping an eye on the future and stuff. And instead, in fact, that kind of leads to other problems we'll get into with the new version. But I think that's one of the things that, like, one of the ways that it, as we talked about before, it kind of diluted things.
Yeah, it's it was interesting because 2004 version, it was very slick, very well made. I would say it's generally a scarier movie than the 1978 version, which I guess is not too difficult, I suppose, when you think of the difference in the effects and things. But it did lose a lot of the social commentary. It's more about, you're just focused on the group of people and how they're surviving. But there's so many of them. I think that was my main thing. There was no real strong connection to any of the characters. I mean, obviously you can have a higher body count, which I'm sure was why they had so many characters. But it did lose something. I mean, you kind of did. There was some sort of connection to some of the main characters, and there was it was interesting having a nurse as one of the characters, so so she can sort of identify what it is about the virus that spreads and things, because that's not often too explicitly done. But it was interesting how they had abortion in the 1970s version that was dealt with as part of the movie. But interestingly, in that one, maybe it's a reflection of the time, but Fran didn't seem to have much say in it. When they were talking about it, they were just like, so Steve, what you going to do? You're going to abort it or what? It wasn't like no one was asking Fran, which I thought, I don't know, maybe that was a conscientious thing to include, but totally different spin on the 2004 one, in that he had the zombie baby. And I'm still kind of thinking about that. And like, does that have a symbolic thing, or is it purely just kind of freak show appeal? I kind of felt it was freak show appeal, and
I think so.
Like, I'd never seen like a zombie baby before.
Right.
And then there's the kind of the shock value of someone has to kind of then get rid of the zombie baby. So
I feel like that's overall, reflect that, that version of the remake where it, like you said, a lot of things were done for shock value. A lot of it was like kind of where there was not a trust, or it seemed like the director didn't really, kind of trust that, like, your attention would be held if there wasn't like kind of, things constantly thrown at you. Like right off the bat, as you said, it's scary and exciting, like kind of where just minutes in, we have, a zombie attack, right? Whereas in, the original, it took like probably at least good 20 minutes before we got to the first actual zombie. Like it was the building that the SWAT team kind of went in, and they kind of countered the zombies and stuff like that. So I think that's one of the key differences, was like that things were kind of like boom boom boom, kind of constantly coming at you with the remake, and whereas it was more of a slow burn, if you will, for the original.
Well, a slow burn and a slow zombie. Let's get into like
yes.
slow versus
that.
fast zombies, because this is the key difference, right? And I think there's two. The main difference here is, right, with your fast zombies, you're kind of looking at them like monsters that you have to run away from. It's like an adrenaline kind of jump scare style zombie. That's the threat. With the slow zombies, or Romero's original ones, what you're faced against is something that is more just it lacks conscious thought, and it's driven by this thing, but it's more of a sort of a creeping sort of death that will kind of consume you. But if you've noticed this, and might have kind of makes this point as well, if you start making stupid or you do sort of reckless things, or things that don't have much conscious thought, that's when you get bitten. Yeah. So it's kind of like the sheer number of them, and you making mistakes or you do something sort of reckless is what gets you killed. Because there's actually a lot of his movies are focused on how you plan things and how you get from A to B and things like this. So it's, as soon as you deviate from the plot, what I think he's really saying though is that, like, if we don't act with conscious thought or focus when we're actually making our decisions for survival, that's when we're going to have our comeuppance.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that's interesting too, that we kind of went from this idea that, like, in some respects, different times the zombies could be almost comical, right? Where as long as you, like you said, you have conscious thought and you're thinking about it, it's they're not a huge threat. You can kind of take your time and like kind of figure things out and stuff. But if you have too much complacency, then that's how it's going to bite you in the ass and stuff. It's like kind of where that's an interesting kind of commentary too, I think, of just different times, things kind of being basically more at a time when things are more deliberate, I think, versus nowadays. In fact, I feel like that's kind of like the fast zombies and the whole media thing kind of really goes hand in hand, where we're being bombarded by information and bombarded by things happening that it's really hard to navigate. It's really like it's really hard to kind of have that kind of time to think.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and that is exactly the symptom, I think, of a lot of what social media and the news cycle in various forms makes us. We've got locked into a kind of emotional, reactive kind of state to a lot of news stories or things that come up, like things that so want to sort of grab your attention and make you react. That we're in fast zombie mode. We're not sort of like trying to sort of actually think about a reasoned and thought out response to things. We're just like, oh my god, LOL, this, click that, and we're definitely in a reactive kind of mode a lot of time, when we're interacting with this kind of stuff. And I mean, I think with the whole the other difference that I noticed between the two, and this is actually a difference between Romero's zombie movies and I think a lot of others, is that the zombies still have some sort of vague conscious thought or memory left over. Like the fact that Steve kind of can, when he's a zombie, he comes back and he knows where to go to get them. And you see other people sort of vaguely grasping at tools and things that they might have once used. In most other zombie movies that have followed these, they're just sort of like wild animals that just chase you down and eat you. There's none of this kind of, there's none of that grey area explored of, what is an unthinking person and, are they human, are they not? And the only other one I can think of that kind of looks at that is I Am Legend, which also sort of has some sort of grey area in between.
That's true.
With the most conscious being the Omega Man and the least being either actually all three of them really. The least being the I Am Legend with Will Smith, where they kind of where they're just inconsistent and they seem like sort of monsters, but they can also create traps and have dogs and things. But anyway, we covered that. But yeah, I mean, that's one thing that really sort of hit me. And actually with Day of the Dead, because one thing I realized watching Dawn of the Dead is that I always get it confused with Day of the Dead.
Okay.
And I actually prefer Day of the Dead much more than Dawn
really?
of the Dead.
That's
even though I think Dawn of the Dead is much more original.
Mm.
I think, in especially, you know, the comments on consumerism are really, really sort of powerful. But Day of the Dead, I think just overall is just a more enjoyable movie.
Wow.
Just because I just like Bob, the zombie they try to train to be human. I think that's just really, it's a bit more kind of comic maybe. But the other thing I realized when I was really starting to look at what is it actually, what is it about Night of the Living Dead that you know came up with this idea of a zombie that wasn't being controlled by someone else. And I think it comes back to this idea of, I keep going back to the Vietnam War, because when you think about how trauma is described or expressed, they say, you know, when you can't you know, verbalize or process an experience, that's basically the root of trauma. Right. And I kind of feel like this is a sort of a hangover from the Vietnam War, in that Romero is saying that zombies are more or less like societal trauma. You know, they, in a sort of a plot sense, they signify the collapse of society, but I think in a sort of more deeper way, they're kind of like society's trauma expressed as a kind of creature.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point in that, you know, and another way to look at it too is the idea that like that only spreads too, because the more things are kind of, you know, not expressed, it just only kind of grows, like, you know, like it festers, like a you know, a psychological wound, if you will, of society, and it's only going to, you know, lead to more. And so in effect, what you have is like kind of people, you know, all not expressing things until, you know, finally you have something erupt, like the whole, you know, MeToo phenomenon, or like kind of, you know, Harvey Weinstein and stuff like that, where you know, it just kind of, you know, sore that kind of just you know, just explodes with, you know, kind of psychological pus and stuff like that. And it's just, you know, it just kind of just at some point it'll have to, doesn't necessarily mean that like, you know, anything will be healed. We'll just have an open, you know, sore and stuff, you know, which is kind of where we're at now. But it just kind of it'll just keep growing, like kind of, you know, just like a sore, it'll just keep swelling up and until like it just has to go somewhere. And the only thing it can do, right, is manifest as a, you know, a nasty kind of, you know, explosion and stuff.
I think we have to just take a moment and appreciate your description of Me Too as the explosion of psychological pus. I think that's pretty amazing.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Another way to look at it too is the idea that like that only spreads too, because where the more things are kind of, you know, not expressed, it just only kind of grows, like, you know, like it festers, like a psychological wound, if you will, of society, and it's only going to, you know, lead to more. And so in effect, then that like what you have is like kind of people, you know, all not expressing things until, you know, finally you have something erupt, like the whole, you know, MeToo phenomenon, or like kind of, you know, Harvey Weinstein and stuff like that, sore that kind of just, you know, just explodes with, you know, kind of psychological pus and stuff like that. And it's just, you know, it just kind of just at some point it'll have to, it doesn't necessarily mean that like, you know, anything will be healed. We'll just have an open, you know, sore and stuff, you know, which is kind of where we're at now. But it just kind of it'll just keep growing, like kind of, you know, just like a sore, it'll just keep swelling up and until like it just has to go somewhere. And the only thing it can do, right, is manifest as a, you know, a nasty kind of, you know, explosion and stuff.
I think we have to just take a moment and appreciate your description of Me Too as the explosion of psychological pus. I think that's pretty amazing. But yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's that's a great way of describing these sort of things that fester and come bubble up to the surface, so to speak.
You know, because after what's all said and done, I mean, I feel like just even though like there's more awareness and there's kind of more dialogue and stuff, and which is great, but I think we're still kind of like in the process of finding some way to kind of heal it, because like here you have like lots of angry people, a lot of like kind of and to some degree, I think what's healthy is that there is more discussion and like kind of that it's kind of like in a way just the same as like kind of when somebody finally admits it, like, oh crap, like I better take care of that and stuff. They at least get disinfected. They at least like kind of put a Band-Aid on it and stuff. And I feel like that's maybe what we're at. We put a bandage on it and stuff, but the healing process is going to take time. It's going to take it's not as though anything's really been solved yet. I think is what I'm saying. Like even though that like we've taken somebody like a Weinstein off the street and stuff, but how many other things are out there that like are still just kind of either now they're kind of gone more into the shadows or like kind of that like that maybe now like some of those other people are more discreet, but it's still going on. I think like I think that's kind of the other reality of it.
No, I think inequality is going to be that's going to come back to bite us at some point and I think The Land of the Dead looks at that a little bit as well. His movie from 2005 had a big sort of theme of inequality.
And I think what's interesting about the Romero series is that like he will start out with the female characters kind of being a little bit the typical meek and to some degree weaker, but each time like they toughen up. They kind of like in this case Fran like kind of picks up a rifle and she like and then by the end of the movie she's flying a helicopter. Like kind of initially she's just this passenger, but then like kind of somehow she realizes that like if I'm depending on this guy and he dies, what happens then?
Absolutely. And I think as well that the whole thing of purpose is underpinned by the point that they're very sort of alienated from each other at that point in the movie. But when Steve's teaching her how to fly the helicopter, that's one of the times when you see them actually sort of like bonding and actually sort of interacting like humans.
Yeah.
And the rest of the time they're almost becoming like the zombies, but just in the mall by themselves. But yeah.
Yeah. That is a really telling point though, that like it's interesting how that one exchange kind of really showed that there was something there that like we're a kind of a deeper connection and stuff. And maybe that's like kind of just even like a just this kind of perspective that like when we are like kind of growing or learning together and stuff, then we're not just mindlessly consuming. We're and we have more like, in other words, as consumers it's really hard to kind of find some connection to each other and stuff like that, unless we do something other than that. We're not going to really connect with each other, like kind of, I mean, whether that was the intent or not, that is really a great example of something that's shown versus being told, telling us, like kind of that idea.
Another thing that was kind of interesting for me I think there's a theme of colonialism in there as well. And when the protagonists first get to the mall, they kind of close it all off. And there's this bit with this kind of tribal drumming, and they're there basically picking off the indigenous people of the mall, and then they enjoy the spoils of it afterwards. I couldn't help thinking that was, and I mean, also I think music is used pretty interestingly in the movie. I mean, I really love Dario Argento's soundtrack, but apparently a lot of the music in it, there's two. I didn't realize there's two different versions. There's an international cut which has got more of Dario Argento and the Goblins music, and there's the US one which has Romero did a lot. He wanted a lot of the scenes in the mall to have music, but it's all been kind of detuned to make it all kind of like just sound really, bizarre and creepy. But it's really effective. It's quite comical. It's really good. I didn't realize also Dario Argento got a writing credit for the movie.
Wow, interesting.
And
I didn't either.
Yeah, I just know when I was looking through the credits I saw that. But yeah,
I mean that was one thing that to me stuck out about the original that I really enjoyed. Because as I mentioned before, my entry into the whole Dead series was Dawn of the Dead, and the thing that like really stuck with us, as kids and stuff too. So that's, like kind of, I'm not sure if I'd recommend it nowadays for kids to kind of, watch this as one of their first, horror movies and stuff. But at the same time, having that offbeat music and just like kind of just the comical aspect of them running through the mall and stuff, it was both a kind of a fantasy that, like, even now, like, to some degree, I have to admit that, like, like, it would be cool, like, if you're gonna do anything, surviving the mall would be like one of the best things to do in a zombie apocalypse and stuff, where you can have free reign over everything.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, there's that in the Omega Man as well. This idea of, like, when you can go and do whatever you want in a post-apocalyptic world.
Right.
But I thought actually what was very clever about the 2004 version was when they decide to get on a boat and go to an island, which obviously doesn't go quite as well as they planned.
Right.
And from my experience of living on an island, it is actually not a good place to, you don't avoid all the illnesses of the world. What happens is people travel to that place and they bring all the different various strains of those illnesses. So you actually tend to get worse versions, I think. And of course, you don't have the infrastructure that you would in a big city.
Right.
Resources. So yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think they got that. They hit the nail on the head with the 2004 version. You do not want to get into a boat if you're trying to escape a zombie apocalypse. I actually think the mall is probably, of course, we won't have any if a zombie apocalypse does strike us, but it's a pretty sensible place to go. You've got lots of different things on hand.
I think the downside, though, of the mall is the fact that, like, it is such a sensible place to be had that then everybody else would get that idea. So in reality, between that's probably like one of the big flaws of both versions is the fact that, like, other than the zombies, you probably would have a lot of other survivors kind of having that bright idea. Like, hey, let me go to the mall, or let me go to the Walmart and stuff. And then next thing you know, you're fighting, like, kind of, not only the zombies, but each other.
Yeah, I wonder if that really would happen, though. I think people,
that's hard to say.
When faced with an existential threat, I think people do tend to band together. And you can look at all the kind of Greta Thunberg stuff that's been going on in Europe. I think it's actually it would have more of a rallying effect. It's very cynical, I think, to think that we would all be fighting over our, Twinkies in Walmart and things like this. I think
I mean, I think that's one of the questions that, the whole Walking Dead series really kind of extended to a greater degree. And I think that's one of the things that, like, it is hard to say, because I think it depends a lot on a lot of other things where, for dramatic effect, it's really hard to tell a story if you just have a bunch of people kind of just, coming together. And, in reality, if it's just a few people, then they probably would, like you said, they would kind of come to some agreement and stuff like that. But I'm envisioning, like, kind of just even my experiences in a very, pre-apocalyptic world where you have, like, a bunch of extras on a movie set that they're, like, kind of all of a sudden they've been working all day, they're hungry and stuff like that, and then they're finally allowed to eat. What you see is, like, kind of people just descending on the lines, and there's some order. But imagine that, and you take away from, like, kind of the auspices of, like, kind of, modern kind of senses of, like, right and wrong and decency and stuff like that. Now, like, kind of people are just hungry and desperate and stuff like that. I think you have more like the Titanic, where people are just scrambling for the lifeboats, and like, if you, heaven forbid or God forbid you should get in their way.
Night of the Living Extras. Okay. Interesting. I've never seen that. Yeah. So yeah, basically don't ever get on a boat. And apart from anything else, I mean, from people I know that have owned boats, it's that, they just constantly go wrong. They need so much maintenance and everything else, a nightmare. But yeah. Another thing did you spot all the cameos in the 2004 version?
That's true. Like, I spotted a couple. One, of course, was, like Rogers, or the SWAT guy is all of a sudden the priest and stuff like that. So that was like a big one.
He was Peter was the televangelist.
Yeah.
You had Roger was he was the general in one of the TV broadcasts.
Oh, okay, I missed that one.
Yeah. Tom Savini
Yes.
He was also in the first one as a raider,
Yes.
but he's also in this one as a
sheriff.
Sheriff, that's right. Yep. And they didn't have Galen Ross, but one of the stores in the mall was called Galen Ross.
Yes.
So, yeah.
That's right.
I think Zack Snyder had a cameo in it as well as a...
Oh, really?
Or something like that, yeah, somewhere. I IMDb'd that one, but yeah.
Nice. So, any other kind of thoughts on like kind of what worked or didn't work in the remake and stuff?
The remake. I mean, it was very slick. I thought it was well written. I thought it had a nice balance of comedy and horror. It just, yeah. I mean, in terms, as is mostly the case with reboots, it was a very serviceable movie that did it. And I think, James Gunn did a good job with writing it. When I saw his credit, his name come up in the credits, I thought, oh, okay, this is probably going to be pretty decent. And Zack Snyder, I can see why he got lots of work afterwards. It was well directed. Right. It was pretty tense and tight.
Right.
It had a good pacing to it, but it just lacks all the social commentary. That was my main criticism with it. It doesn't really have much to make you go back to it afterwards. Yeah. The other thing I really noticed that was really kind of obvious, there were so many kind of flashing images of zombie faces all the way through the movie, especially at the beginning at the end. It was like I was kind of closing my eyes and seeing zombie faces, for a few hours afterwards, and I was like, wow, this is really subconscious kind of programming on the part of Gunn and Snyder, whoever it was that decided to do that.
Yeah, I feel like that's overall, was the weakness of it, was the fact that like it was, you felt like you were bombarded by things. I mean, on the one hand, like you said, it's very tight. A lot of things were happening, and it was exciting certainly. And to a degree, like kind of in itself, it's like almost a commentary just by its very nature that just again like there's almost like kind of nowadays the same thing with the media as a whole. There's not a trust that like we can make informed decisions or kind of come to our own conclusions. It's rather nowadays we're told through the media, this is the conclusions you should come to, or this is like kind of what's happening and stuff. Like just by bombarding you with information, bombarding you with, what is the spin, if you will.
Yeah, and you get that in movies as well. You're right. You get bombarded with plot points and bombarded with twists and everything else. And just like, you must follow these plot points exactly. There's very little room for ambiguity. And I think as well, going back to a conversation we had offline about awe in movies, this idea that when you experience this level of awe in movies is when your senses are kind of overwhelmed by what's going on. Like you see them panning through a shot of a futuristic city or something like this, and you're like, wow, something like when you see it on the movie screen. And this was, you could tell they were trying to do something, in a similar sort of vein with this. They're trying to bombard you with imagery of zombies, and it's all very fast and dangerous, and it's supposed to be like, oh. I don't really think that it really worked in that respect.
And And like we were talking about earlier, that like instead what you have is awful, right? Where like kind of you're full of awe, and it's just kind of like it's really just that thing where whether it's too much CGI, too much of any kind of special effects and stuff like that, it's just that it's too much, and it's like we have this kind of like sensory indigestion that we just kind of go we want to burp, but instead we just kind of like. Have this, like
have a psychological wretch.
Nice.
But I mean, but definitely the effects were well done in this. I thought, it was compared to something like I Am Legend, the effects were much better in the 2004 version.
I think one memorable part though for the new version was the whole, the zombie, kill game that they kind of developed. That was really something kind of original and kind of funny and stuff. Where they went after Jay Leno zombie, Burt Reynolds zombie.
That was it. I mean, the use of comedy was really well done, and I mean, James Gunn got started in making movies with trauma. The trauma movies. Who did like Toxic Avenger and all those things. So that kind of horror comedy genre was very, I guess he kind of cut his teeth. So he's pretty well experienced at that. And I think he's very good at balancing out kind of thrills, horror and comedy in movies. So yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that like was probably like one of the, I don't know, the bothersome part was the whole thing with the dog and the girl going after the dog. Like kind of, I mean, you know, that's probably one of the things that like I probably had the biggest complaint about was just like, you know, I got to give him points for kind of originality of the idea, like kind of having this dog, you know, basically be the delivery system to kind of, somehow they came to the idea that like the dog would be overlooked by the zombies and stuff, even though that like, you know, I don't know how they came up with that conclusion in terms of the character, but I have to give him points for that. But then like, then when somehow it got in trouble, that then like, you know, then the girl going after the dog, I mean, granted to some degree, like maybe part of the thought was to kind of help the other survivor, you know, like kind of, you know, I forget the name of the guy, but
Andy,
you know, maybe part of it was that, but it seemed like, you know, she was so focused on the dog, and I was like, kind of like, really, like, you know, you guys risked the dog to you know, have him be this kind of messenger pigeon for the supplies, but then now all of a sudden you're going to like drive across the zombies to try to save the dog or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's as I sort of said in Romero's ones, people make stupid decisions and they get killed for it. In this one, they really make really dumb decisions like that, or going on a boat and pay the price. And I mean, it's also kind of self-aware in that you've got, I can't remember what it was, like Ty Burrell's character who said, okay, so what, we're going to leave our safe haven, pack everything up and go on a boat. And, you know, no, it was CJ, wasn't it? And so, yeah, and he was like, all right, yeah, I'm in. But it was a pretty stupid idea, right? And everyone gets killed practically on the way. So, yeah.
And it's interesting you bring up CJ because he's probably the one person that had an arc, you know, like kind of, whereas everybody else pretty much was the same character. And what's interesting to me is that like his was probably the least believable too. Like in other words, he did kind of, you know, change, but then like, you know, what made him change? Like kind of just hang around these people, like kind of, you know, suddenly he started liking them because I don't know, like kind of that was another kind of. I think I'm in complaint mode now, and that's another thing when you made me think of.
I know, right? We get on a tangent about. Wasn't it from reading Cosmo? That's
right.
There's the bit, right? He's reading Cosmo. Because I mean, you know, every sort of gun-toting, you know, misogynist is going to be transformed by reading Cosmo.
Yes,
that's all we need to do, right? Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's probably, you know, mostly in the end, you know, like kind of probably, I mean, other than that, like I said, you know, it is an action, you know, adrenaline pumping, you know, zombie romp and stuff. And you know, like it's, you know, like I said, it's not going to be something that, other than like kind of wanting that, you know, kind of rush, I don't see rewatching and stuff, but
no, it doesn't have much rewatchability.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, one thing I did realize as well when comparing the two is just, and it's kind of a shame, really, it's just how good the performances of all the lead characters in the 1978 version are, and most of them really didn't go on to do very much at all.
Right.
And I mean, they really do some really great performances in that movie. They really did a great job. Specifically, Roger, I thought was really good. And also. So yeah, Peter and Roger were just like ridiculously good in that movie. Considering that they're surrounded by people being torn apart with latex, you know, they did a fantastic job of keeping that serious and on point. I mean, there's even bits I noticed where they hadn't even managed to get the coloring of the blood on the latex, and like someone pulled something and it was just like white plastic.
I think that's a reflection of how horror was like kind of just something that like I don't know, like next to porn, there's something like, you know, that like it doesn't reflect well on your acting resume back then. Nowadays, it's you know, just like porn also, it's a very different attitude. Like, you know, you can, you know, apparently do porn and then still like end up in mainstream, roles and stuff like that. It's very much like kind of, just like similarly, like Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger, one of their first movies was Texas Chainsaw Massacre,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I suppose it was, yeah. Okay.
So just something along the way, somehow that idea changed. But before then, though, like, it was probably was like almost like next to a black mark. It's like probably, like one of the things about, horrors for actors and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we're doing our part in highlighting the more intellectual side of horror movies, seeing as we're yet again watching another one. But that's all right. I'm quite always happy to watch more zombie and horror flicks. Yeah.
And that's something we talked about before, that like, one thing that we noticed right off the bat is like horror movies is just such a deep well for these remakes. It's just something that like, we have like probably, if there's any general ratio, it's at least 2 to 1 for like horror compared to like any other, general, genre and stuff. And I think that's only going to be, I think, even more the case.
I think as well what's interesting is what goes on, what horror movie directors and writers go on to do after a while. Because if you look at the number, how many of the Marvel directors that get called back on a regular basis started off in horror? Zack Snyder, who's basically doing all the Justice League movies.
Right.
This was, one of his sort of breakout movies. James Gunn, Scott Derrickson, who did Doctor Strange. He was basically a horror movie director. So, it is interesting that, you wouldn't have thought Disney, Marvel would, lean towards a lot of horror movie directors.
Yeah. But, I think, it's also, I think, just goes back to that idea, though, that like, just like with actors, probably earlier on, it probably didn't reflect well on directors' resumes to like have on there that they did horror, versus nowadays it's clearly that's not the case. If anything, it probably boosts their kind of visibility. Maybe part of it is that fact that like then it shows that they've worked with special effects people and other kind of what you call it, general kind of things, stunts to some degree and stuff. Stuff that like really lends itself to these superhero set pieces and stuff. So maybe that's part of what that overall kind of allows them to make that transition more easily.
Absolutely. Yeah. So any more final closing thoughts on the dawn, as we say, the sun sets on our Dawn of the Dead video?
I think I'm tapped out this time. I think we've really hit on the key points. Maybe kind of for coming up, we've got Ben-Hur, I think, is like one of the ones that we're talking about doing possibly in the future. La Femme, Nikita, which has kind of had several iterations besides a movie version with Bridget Fonda, Point of No Return. It actually was made into even a television series, with Peter Wilson and stuff. So we'll definitely kind of touch on that, even though I don't expect us to watch whole seasons of that series.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
Alrighty.
Till next time.
Till next time. Thanks for watching, and as always, be sure to like, subscribe, and I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we'll see you next time.